You're listening to Queer Skies, a podcast exploring queerness, astrology, and the intersection of both. In this episode, we're joined again by Michael J. Morris, who helps us break down the astrology of November 2019. If you didn't catch episode 4, where we interviewed Michael J. Morris about their work in queer theory, feminist philosophy, and cross-pollination, the links to that will be in the episode description. But for the forecast for November 2019, sit back and relax because we've got queer skies ahead.
Welcome back to Queer Skies. We're so happy to be joined again by Michael Morris, who was our guest on the last episode where we talked about a lot of fun stuff that we're going to try to put into practice tonight with a forecast for the month of November. So to give a quick recap of sort of the things we talked about in the last episode, I'll turn it over to Michael and then we'll jump into the forecast.
Yeah, so some of the things that we talked about in the previous episode were things like thinking of astrology as a storytelling tradition that's been practiced for thousands of years across countless civilizations, that humans have been looking up at the sky and telling stories in order to make meaning of our lives for as long as we can remember. And so some of the ways that we talked about that coming into play and how we practice astrology was inspired in part by a quote from Donna Haraway, who was quoting Marilyn Strathern and says, "It matters what stories we use to tell stories with." And so as we look at the astrology, as we make our interpretations and our delineations, what are we bringing into the room? What are our frames of reference? What ways of thinking, or what political systems, or what philosophies or theories are shaping how we understand the significations of the symbols that we're working with, whether the planets or the signs or the houses or the aspects? What are we thinking with in order to make meaning with these systems of practice? We also talked about something that's really central in my practice, which is thinking about how astrology or the chart can function as a map back into our own felt experience of the body. How do we live through these stories that we're telling with the astrology? How do we feel into what a particular aspect or what a particular transit might mean for our lives? How do we feel that in our bodies, and how are those felt states actually a way, a guide or a kind of compass towards how we understand how to move through those experiences? How can we face into the feeling that comes up in the face of the transits or the aspects as a way of understanding what they mean for us?
And I might just add to that for those of you who might not know or who haven't listened to the previous episode yet, all three of us are primarily Hellenistic astrologers, or astrologers who use Hellenistic techniques. So if you're not familiar with some of the technical language that we're using, just know that that's where it comes from. However, even as we do deal with technical language, we'll also be bringing in just good old stories and trying to make things from the technical register fit into a more lived register. Do you both agree with that way to frame it?
With the one exception that we tend to cross-pollinate with great results. So cross-pollination was one of the things that we talked about last time at length and interwove, as mentioned by Kelly Surtees in the NORWAC keynote address for 2019. So I would say like Hellenistic is our base, and then we meander appropriately or inappropriately.
Yeah, I agree. I was thinking about that as I was preparing for this recording, and thinking about how my practice is primarily grounded in Hellenistic tradition, and specifically natal astrology. Like, I've done some reading and some study in mundane astrology, but it's not my focus. And so I would just say for everyone listening that even though we're going to be talking through some of the themes of particular planets and their relationships to signs and to one another, that at least from my perspective, all of that needs to be grounded in some kind of understanding of where those signs and planets are in your own chart. And so working from a Hellenistic tradition, I'm thinking of, I work with the whole sign house system. So if we are talking about Scorpio, whatever it is, whatever kind of story we're telling with what moves through Scorpio, really contextualizing that in the place in your chart that Scorpio occupies, whatever house or place that occupies, and fitting that into other systems of meaning making, like annual perfections or other timing techniques of really understanding anything we're saying as going to be specifically sifted and distilled in a particular way that's really unique to your chart. And everything we say is what's happening in the sky for all of us, but how it shows up in our lives is going to be very different depending on the particularity of our charts.
Totally. So where do we want to start for the month?
Well, on November 1st, Venus makes its ingress into Sagittarius, which for me is a pretty major shift for a couple of reasons. One, we have both of the benefics in the same sign, in the same house. Venus has reception from Jupiter being co-present. Jupiter's in Sagittarius, and as the ruler of the domicile, Venus has reception. And so that's a lot of ease for both of those planets as they reinforce the beneficence of one another. And then also for the planets that are moving through Libra, specifically Mars, in its last couple of weeks in Libra, Mars now has reception from Venus. So as long as Venus was in Scorpio, they were exchanging signs, but they didn't make a traditional aspect to one another. They were in aversion. So now that Venus is moving into Sagittarius on November 1st, they're making a whole sign sextile to one another, which for me invites me to consider or look at what are the themes that have been coming up in the story of Mars moving through Libra, which for me has a lot to do with finding the role of the individual in the collective. How do we take action? How do we take charge in ways that are always grounded in solidarity and coalition and collaboration, which is maybe not the way that Mars tends to prefer to operate. And so because Mars is in detriment or exile in Libra, having reception from Venus feels like it's going to give those lessons a place to go. Like the end of that story, whatever the outcome of that story of Mars moving through Libra is, now it has the resources it needs to move forward, to take those lessons of learning how to be an individual, how to take action with others, and do something with that. So that's part of what I'm looking forward to in Venus moving into Sagittarius, in addition to the co-presence with Jupiter.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'm noticing with Venus moving through Sagittarius, which I'm so excited for, I think having the benefics together like this, both of these planets, Venus and Jupiter, are moist. Moisture pulls things together. So I've been thinking about like Jupiter, the Jupiter-Neptune square it's actually now separating. We've had a few exact hits of that aspect, and we've talked about it a little bit on the podcast before. With Venus moving through Sagittarius, Venus is going to make that square to Neptune again. I'm wondering what both of you think about that. What does a Venus-Neptune square say to you in the context of a Jupiter-Neptune square? Just to sort of get some words flowing. When I think of Sagittarius, I think of vision. I think of, with Neptune in aspect, I think of dreaming. We've talked about the theme of illusion and delusion being very important themes with this square. Daniel had some very insightful things to say on one of our previous episodes. So Daniel, do you want to recap maybe like some of the Sagittarius Pisces square action and what that means to you?
As the self-proclaimed Jupiter child, I would love to. And I actually need to look up an Instagram post because someone posted and Adrienne Marie Brown reposted. So I should really just search. I can't like search and talk at the same time. But it spoke to me on some levels. And I really think that it kind of helps explain what I think about as the difference between Venus in Sagittarius and Jupiter in Sagittarius. So the post was by Yumi Sakugawa, and it says, number one, gratitude and desiring more are not mutually exclusive. Number two, it is better to pursue a desire and be disappointed than to never pursue a desire, because at least in the former, you end up in a brand new place with completely different scenery that activates previously unknown parts of you. And number three, desiring and receiving pleasure are daily practices that require discipline, consistency, dedication, frequency, focus, attention, intention, new challenging situations. And for me, I think about the Jupiter square Neptune in these mutable signs, and Jupiter in its domicile of Sagittarius as being very direction oriented or goal oriented, you could say, but definitely like there's a trajectory, there's a point A, there's a point B, there's a line that connects them, and that hyper focus. I think about it as that more aspect, and Jupiter is all about that more. And we've been experiencing that, and especially that tension with what is possible. The Neptune in Pisces is helping us imagine what is possible, think of different possibilities. But how do we get there, and how fast can we get there? And I think that Jupiter joining Sagittarius brings in that gratitude and the piece of pleasure in that process. Jupiter is not always pleasurable. I think, as much as it's joyous and wonderful, I do think that when those two benefics come together, co-present in a sign, there's just that blend of warmth and blend of the nice complementary energies blending together creates just even more. And so I think about the Venus in Sagittarius really adding that element that we're done with that square aspect. It's separating. We can move forward, and that complements very nicely too with that forward momentum from Jupiter, who is now zooming into or out of Sagittarius, which will happen very close to the end of the month of November. So, and I don't think we said the date of that Venus Neptune square. That is the 14th of November, very soon after the first lunation of the month. Mm-hmm. So maybe we want to talk about that first before we talk Jupiter ingress.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up the topic of pleasure, because that's a big part of what stands out to me in terms of the full moon in Taurus. But I also, just to say a couple of thoughts on the Venus square Neptune, the question of boundaries comes up in terms of both of these mutable signs. Venus signifying our relationships, our approach to love. Jupiter is coherence. Jupiter holds things together, but Neptune is dispersing. And there's something really beautiful about that, to recognize that we're part of something bigger, that we are a member of a collective consciousness, that there is no truly individuated self. And that's part of what Neptune can teach us in the realm of dreams, in the realm of fantasy, or just non-ordinary reality. But sometimes then in the context of interpersonal relationships, it becomes a question of, how do I maintain boundaries that are healthy and necessary in order for me to feel safe, in order for me to feel secure, in order for me to practice love well? How do I hold those boundaries while also recognizing that I am not separate? And for me, that's the challenge of that square, is how do I maintain the boundaries that actually allow me to love better, allow me to be more loving and to receive love well? How do I maintain those boundaries and my own sense of internal coherence, that piece that comes from Jupiter, while also recognizing that part of what is also true is that there is a larger sense of oneness, that we are a drop within a sea, that we are not ultimately separable, even though we are even though we feel ourselves at some kind of edge that we think of as a boundary of what is and is not okay. And so it feels like that piece is going to come in that November square that Venus is making.
Yeah, Jupiter being the planet of expansion and these both being Jupiter signs, like that theme of boundaries sounds really poignant for this, because with Venus in a Jupiter sign, Venus being a general signifier for relationships and how we do relationships, when Venus is in a Jupiter sign and Jupiter is in the sign as well, it's like, how can I go beyond the boundaries? How can I connect in a way that I didn't think was possible before, but now I see it and I have the vision for it? And throwing in the Neptune piece, like you're saying, Michael, there is this very fine line that's almost invisible. I was thinking about this aspect earlier, and the word untethering came to mind. I think of Pisces as like an ocean, and if Venus is this boat full of possible pleasure and love in the sign of Sagittarius, it's like this Neptune square is like untying the boat from the rafters and just like going off into the ocean. But there's some danger in that, right? There is maybe some doubt that the quest is fraught, or there might be a storm on the way. Jupiter also, I saw this on Twitter, I'm sorry, I don't remember who said it, but Jupiter traditionally rules storms. So there's this possibility for great conquest in a non-militaristic way, but also being lost in a way. Like there are troubles that come with having such a great vision, and the question of whether you can achieve it. So that's when the boundaries come into play, is I need to temper myself. I need to have a healthier relationship with my vision for love or for pleasure.
What did you say? If Venus is this boat full of possible love and pleasure? I'm into it. This is a story I want to hear and a story I want to tell. So thanks for that language.
Let's keep telling it then. You were going to talk about the full moon, I think.
Yeah,
which is
the full moon.
Venus ruled sign, so it's very relevant for this.
Indeed, yeah. So the full moon is exact on November 12th at I think it's like 9:33 a.m. Eastern time. It's Tuesday in the U.S. And yeah, the moon is in Taurus. It's in its exaltation. It is ruled by Venus and Sagittarius, who's co-present with Jupiter. And so the sensation, as I try to feel into what is this lunation, is a more than enough feeling that's indicated in multiple ways. I have Taurus rising, so I think this full moon brings up for me a desire for like excellent, nourishing food and for getting in touch with sensuous pleasures. I think this is a good full moon for having sex with yourself or with someone else. I think if you're someone who has orgasms, this is a good day for it. I think it's a good day for luxuriating in states of arousal. And with Venus and Sagittarius, there's that piece that you were talking about going beyond your own boundaries in some sense. Or when I think of Sagittarius, it's always like reaching beyond the horizon, going beyond the edges of the known. So this could be a good time to experiment and find new pleasures, maybe indulge in paying for some good feminist or queer porn and see if there's something you haven't seen before, or something that you might like, because ethical porn starts with paying for porn, paying people for their sexual labor. Pink Label TV is a great resource for that. So I'm thinking like it's a day of indulgence. It's a day of luxuriating. It's a good time for expanding our experience of pleasure, for maybe experimenting with new pleasures, whether that's really whatever form of sensory pleasure, bringing us back to the body and an enjoyment of the body. Makes me think of something that Adrienne Marie Brown writes about in Pleasure Activism. She writes that pleasure is a measure of freedom. I think when we think about freedom and we think about pleasure, we have to think about the ways in which access to pleasure is disproportionately distributed to different folks because of systems of oppression, because of ancestral trauma, because of the traumas of just living in the world today in an imperialist, colonialist, white supremacist, capitalist heteropatriarchy. Like all of this is built on us believing that we're not enough, that we don't have access to enough, that there isn't enough, especially enough pleasure, especially enough feeling good. If the systems that we're living through can perpetuate the belief or even the feeling that we are not well, that we are insatiable, that we can't actually have enough, then that fuels capitalism. That fuels this like ongoing dissatisfaction with the things that make us unique or make us diverse. So I think this full moon is a good time to center our own pleasures. And it's also a good time to center the pleasures of those who are most marginalized. It's a good time to ask the question, what can I do to contribute to feeling good for those who don't have access or don't have the same kind of access to feeling good that I have? I think especially those of us who operate with some measure of privilege, whether that's white privilege or privilege according to gender or privilege according to ability or nationality or and so on, that if we operate with some form of privilege, then I think it's sort of our responsibility to look around and say, who are those who do not have access to this privilege, and how does this privilege allow me not only access to my own pleasure, but to the resources that could be made available to other folks in order for them to experience more abundant, more expansive pleasure as well. So those are some of the things I'm thinking about. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. So something that made me think of too is like what's been happening in Taurus is Uranus has really brought this disruptive. I don't think of Uranus as bringing disruption to Taurus. I think of it as accessing the Taurus resources to bring disruption to other places. And especially with Venus having, at that point, still having rulership over Mars as well, and thinking about all of those pieces that you brought in about Mars and Libra, there is this sense to me of having that abundance. And something that I think of with Sagittarius, which is where Venus is located at this time, is things that happen well in Sagittarius have enough fuel or have the right shape or the right form to get to that point B, if we're thinking about that point A to point B, things that don't fizzle. And I think that the conditions are right for Venus to just have all of those abundant resources at this point in time, at that full moon. And I think that speaks a lot to that embodied feeling, or that access to resources that you may not have thought possible before, or may have been introduced to you, and now is the time to say, I'm going to go there because I'm not worried that I'll use it up, or I'm not worried that it will disappear. It's not too good to be true. It is mine to have just as much as it is others to have, because we are the collective and we do share that. There's just a lot of I was going to say synergy, but synchronicity or harmony there. I think about harmony.
Yeah,
I agree. I think that I really like this piece that you've brought in, Daniel, of the fuel and the capacity to carry on. I think that part of what this full moon is teaching is the recognition that this abundance, this fuel, is actually already available to us. Especially with the moon there, the moon being a general significator for the body. And so as I'm reflecting on these themes of pleasure and who has access to pleasure, just the consciousness that everything we need for abundant pleasure is actually already available to us. All the fuel we need in order to keep going, in order to expand and grow and move beyond our own boundaries, and to find this harmony that you're pointing to, and these ways of being together. All of those resources are actually already available to us. And I think if I was talking through this aspect with someone in a consultation, in an actual consultation setting, some of the things that I would invite people to kind of feel for is the memory or the fantasy of abundant pleasure. Like, when have you known the feeling of more than enough pleasure? And if someone hasn't had that feeling, what do you imagine it feels like? How could fantasy be a resource for connecting you to a sensation of more than enough pleasure, abundant pleasure, that it's already right here, it's in your body, it's in your system? And rather than just letting that stay as a kind of mental image or a kind of picture memory, letting it drop down into the body, what does it actually feel like? What are the sensations? Where do you feel them in your body when you feel good, when you feel like you have access to abundant resources of pleasure? I think about things about like, how do you like to be touched? How do you like to touch yourself? What would the touch of someone who loves you feel like? Whether that's a memory or a fantasy, or things like imagining a delicious taste in your mouth. And maybe you know what that taste is, or maybe it's like something indescribable. It's something out of a fantasy novel or something, but it tastes so good. And what would it feel like to have that delicious taste fill your entire body? What would it feel like to have that sweet goodness, whatever that pleasure, whether it's touch or taste or beautiful music or the comfort of rest, whatever it is? How can you start to find those feelings in your body and recognize that they were actually already there? You actually already have in your system everything you need to get to that place, to get to those pleasurable experiences. And so whether it's on the new moon or on the full moon, actually taking time to access those feeling states, or just knowing that the full moon is teaching us that we have these resources, that you can actually come to this place in your own body whenever you need to, whenever you want to, and that's sort of inherently anti-capitalist. The idea that everything you need in order to feel good is actually already in your system. It's actually already in your body. That feels like the lesson of this lunation, and especially because it's the full moon that follows from. I mean, this is dipping back into October, but it's following after the new moon in Scorpio that we're coming up on as we record this, and without dipping too far back into October. Part of how I'm thinking about that new moon in Scorpio is confronting our shame. And what does it take to see ourselves in the shadows? And then recognizing that this full moon in Taurus is the climax of whatever began with that new moon in Scorpio. So what are the shames? What are the shame narratives? What are the ways of feeling good, the desires or the pleasures that we haven't been able to say out loud, that we haven't maybe even been able to acknowledge that we experience? And then how does this full moon in Taurus in November on the 12th give us an opportunity to bring those things out into the light, to actually allow ourselves to experience more fully our desires and our pleasures, because experiencing our desires and our pleasures more fully is part of what's necessary in order to experience ourselves more fully. We cannot be our full selves if the things that we want, the things that bring us joy and satisfaction, if those things are buried in shame, there are parts of ourselves we just can't be. And I think that's part of what this lunation cycle from the new moon in Scorpio to the full moon in Taurus could be teaching us.
That is so beautiful. And not only, I feel like, does it connect to that Scorpio new moon, but it also connects back to the Taurus new moon that we experienced. I was looking up the date, May 4th. And that idea that what has happened between May and now. And I've just been getting this from everything we've been saying, this Saturnian vibe. And I'm like, no, nothing's happening this month in Saturn. I can't really connect that. But I'm recognizing now that this is almost the finale, I would say, to a summer that was full of Saturn and full of things that for the people that I was looking at their charts for in consult, and for the people that I had no idea what their chart was, but they were just coming to me with their stories, of letting go of that very south node experience of like releasing things that have been maybe kept buried for years, that have prevented us from seeing that abundance and prevented us from seeing feelings, prevented us from connecting to those feelings. When we talk about embodiment or awareness of what is already inside us, we don't have that awareness all the time. Sometimes it requires that shaking loose of things. I just so love this ending of this Saturn part for all these people that have come to me in pain, and are experiencing that part of the summer that was letting go of things and coming to the realization, that process of realizing that there's something that's preventing me from achieving the pleasure that I know is possible deep down. And the thing about the stories that people have come through this summer have been, they don't have a safe space to land in. They're just like leaping with that faith of what they feel in their body. And whether it's in relationships where they just know that it's done, or it is jobs. So many people, my mother did something for me that is so deeply ingrained, which is never leave a job until you have something to go to. And I've been like, yes, okay, great. So I've just been like really shook about all the people that have come up to me and they're like, yeah, I was doing this and now I have no idea what I'm doing. Like, I guess I'll start a search process. And some still have not found that thing, and relationships still have not come to their next stepping stone of wherever they're going to end up. And these are like long-term relationships, very, very south node. And it feels like this Venus in Sagittarius is maybe that opportunity to say, here's the harbor, or here is the conclusion, or here's the pleasure. And now we are ready to really integrate that experience. As Jupiter comes out of Sagittarius as well. So it's really wrapping up those Sagittarius themes, but also as we're getting the shadow of Capricorn, or of Saturn's retrograde through Capricorn, before it starts to go on to its next phase eventually in Aquarius. So there's a lot that I feel like is resolving here, and resolving in joy and pleasure, like we're talking about. Very beautiful. Also happening with the Venus Sagittarius conjunction is this important Mars-Uranus opposition that we've been skirting around. So maybe we should talk about that next.
Yeah,
that sounds cool. Mars-Uranus, like we think about the Tower card in the tarot, something that comes out of nowhere. Mars being a hot planet brings things quickly. It's a planet about speed, about heat, about passion, and Uranus being the unexpected. So when these two things are in opposition, and in the signs that they're in too, in fixed signs that like to hold on to things, that like to sustain things, it feels like there are themes around needs being met. In the physical register with Taurus and in the emotional register with Scorpio, there are patterns and things that have built up over time and have been sustaining. And these patterns are being shaken up first by the new moon in Scorpio and then by Mars opposite Uranus. And this Mars opposite Uranus feels like an opportunity to interrupt those patterns and find different ways of acquiring needs. And maybe not even just the same needs, but also different needs. Like when we think about Mars-Uranus, a word that comes up a lot of times is erupt. Like, oh, there's going to be this thing that erupts into reality that I didn't see coming. And when Mars is involved, there's often something to do with the self, like I want this, this is me. So like earlier when we were talking about Mars and Libra, that's not Mars's territory, right? Mars is typically like, I want this. And Mars in Scorpio really wants this, really wants to go deep and find what the source of its vulnerability is and hold on to it. Because if I don't protect that, then I could die. It's literally about survival. So Scorpio and Taurus bringing in this opportunity, this eruption of saying what I need. I want to think about it less as eruption and declaring what I need. And I want to think about it more as interrupting my needs and what I think my needs are in order to create new possibilities for not just how I can get my needs, but the literal needs. Like Scorpio, Uranus and Taurus being a sign about how you feed yourself, right? Like Michael was saying with the Taurus full moon, like it's a great time to be lavish or to eat a really good meal. Taurus wants to be fed, and Uranus and Taurus is like, you want to be fed, but did you think about being fed this way? And I think that is exactly what this opposition is bringing into play. It's thinking, I need something, and I don't know what it is yet, but this new moon and then this Mars opposite Uranus is starting to force the realization that there are different ways to need and different things to need.
Yeah, totally. I think that's the idea of breaking. If there's some sort of breaking with established patterns around what is it that I need or how is it that I meet my needs, that feels really rich as a delineation for this. Yeah, look, I when I think of Mars, I think of action and assertion, but also severing and separating. And other keywords that I use for Uranus are things like disruption and revolution and upheaval, as well as a demand for authenticity, even if it means breaking from some sort of established pattern or ways of being in the world, which could be, here's what I believe that I needed. Here's what I believed that we needed. Here's what I thought it meant to be fed well. Here's what I thought it meant to be nurtured and nourished and rested. And maybe I'm being challenged to interrupt that and even to separate from that. This opposition, for me, feels like it could demand something be cut off or moved away from, whether that's a context or a relationship that's holding us in those old ways of being, in those old ways of feeling, those established patterns. I mean, again, both in fixed signs, they don't really want to change how they're doing things. But then there's this dynamite moment between Mars and Uranus that says, yeah, I understand that you have these established patterns of feeling and being in the world, and something has to change. It's not working anymore. In something like, in order to break new ground or break away or break through into a new feeling or a new way of showing up in the world, what needs to be severed? What needs to be cut off or cut out? And I think that whatever, again, like I said at the beginning, whatever house Scorpio occupies might be a clue as to where that could show up in people's lives. That Uranus is, this is a long transit of Uranus through Taurus. So it feels like the volatility of whatever is going to get shaken up in this opposition is going to show up more in the Scorpio side of the equation, more of the, where is Mars transiting right now, and how is this long story that Taurus is telling, or that Uranus and Taurus is telling us, how is that long story showing up in this particular place right now, because that's where Mars is in Scorpio.
I love that. And I love the idea to, I'll add to the interpretations of Mars. I think of it as taking the word individual and verbing it, making it into a verb. So it's the process of individuating yourself. What is separating yourself from other people? What makes you unique? And I think that there's that threat of being lost in Libra that Mars was experiencing, but how do I exist as an individual in a collective, that it now can freshly ingressed into Scorpio get reinforced from that authentic Uranus, and to give it permission to return to that process of individuation and holding on to what makes it an individual, in some cases above the needs of the collective that it was operating in. And I think about that need to sever or break as being for the individual's ability to actually understand the larger collective too, or the larger process that's happening there. Because Mars returns to Libra again and again. And so, Mars is not done. But what does Mars get through this iteration of opposing Uranus and having that perfect diametric view of what's been happening in Taurus, what resources have been becoming more abundant, or what resources have been unearthed for perusal.
Speaking of perusal, that makes me think of Mercury, and the fact that this gets back to the point, or the theme of aversions going away this month, with Mars moving into Scorpio, beginning to give some reception to Mercury, who's in Scorpio. And Mercury is going to be retrograde when Mercury will have just turned direct once this opposition takes place. Still moving pretty slowly. So it almost feels like maybe the words are clicking into place at that time, or the language is starting to develop for what these new needs are.
Yeah, so that I don't know if we said the date that Mercury stations is November 20th. That Mercury stations direct. Mercury isn't going to clear the retrograde shadow until December 7th. So I think that's this process that you're pointing to of bringing the words together and finding how to express what it is that we're finding in these depths. How does it relate to the long term, to these, to the world that we're trying to be, or the world that we're trying to make, that Saturn is signifying. We might not have words for that for a while, but I think that stationing direct is going to start to bring the pieces together. As you said, there is a moment on November 11th when Mercury is conjunct the Sun, so a moment we call Cazimi, that could be a burst of clarity or just a flash of insight that's not going to end this process of review and reflection and moving through our own internal depths of trying to figure out what is it that I have not yet said, what is it that I have not yet expressed. The Cazimi is not going to resolve all of that, but just paying attention to it. That maybe that's a date for folks to mark on calendars, November 11th. And what are the insights or the messages or the clues or the words that come to me that day that maybe says something about what this process is for, what is coming to the surface from these dark waters of Scorpio, what's coming up, and how do I start to express that or communicate that or translate that for other people. The Cazimi could be a moment of insight there.
The other thing I love about that idea of this Scorpio Capricorn development that's happening, Drew, is this idea that Jupiter's time in Sagittarius is coming to a close. Michael, you mentioned when you do chart work, you look at the houses and you look at the cycles in your own life or in the life of a client. So this may not be a practice that other people have or notice in their chart. But in my chart, when I see that Jupiter's left the shadow of its retrograde, which for this year happens November 6th or 7th, it actually, for me, starts to prepare the next house significations by whole sign house. and maybe integrates the both of them, or maybe serves as a type of balsamic, that period of like intense preparation for the next cycle. But there's always been like this clear, like one of these things is not like the other in the same sign, but it does relate to the house topics of the next sign. And so I like the idea of Jupiter announcing its regal presence in Capricorn a little bit early, like go tell them I'm coming. Because on December 2nd, when Jupiter does enter Capricorn, that changes the Capricorn story, that changes the way that Scorpio and Capricorn are developed through the movement of the planets. And I really think that Mercury has served as a herald for Jupiter, as Jupiter's been kind of in this part of the zodiac. With Sagittarius, it literally like went back and forth to like welcome Jupiter into Sagittarius. And this like back and forth with Saturn the month before Jupiter goes into Capricorn really feels that same way of like, hey, Saturn, heads up. Jupiter's been chasing you and it's here for you. And just that idea too, when we saw Jupiter in Scorpio almost 2 years ago, just really blowing away privacy and blowing open the doors on things that had been hidden. Catching up now with Capricorn, where maybe some changes have happened as a result of that. We're getting a little bit into the mundane here, but even when you apply it to your own life, what was Jupiter doing for you in Scorpio, and how does that now play out in this very grounded material world of Capricorn, and that slow building over time, or that daily discipline, as Drew mentioned, really having a bigger impact. I'm really excited for Jupiter in Capricorn.
Mm-hmm.
Me too, because cohesion, right? Like that was the word that Michael used for Jupiter, is making things make sense. And I feel like there's, with Saturn and the South Node this entire year, Saturn in Capricorn is dignified, but Saturn conjunct the South Node in Capricorn is like, where is everything going? Like, why is my life disappearing in this way? And I think what I've heard some astrologers say is South Node is about making room, right? It's purging in order to make room. And once Jupiter arrives in Capricorn, we still have this month of Jupiter in Sagittarius, and we shouldn't forget that. But once Jupiter arrives in Capricorn, I think it will make the garbage disposal of the South Node make sense, and say like, okay, now we have a clean kitchen. We can make a delicious feast for the entire neighborhood once Jupiter is in Capricorn. But the new moon still has in Sagittarius, still has Jupiter in Sagittarius, which is wonderful. So what do we want to say about that new moon?
Yeah, it looks great. Both the sun and moon are together with both benefics, with Jupiter ruling Sagittarius, and both are right there with reception. The new moon is in aversion to both Mars and Saturn, so there's no maltreatment here. And we've talked a lot about Sagittarius tonight. So just to reiterate some of the themes that we've mentioned, of this idea of going beyond your own borders, going beyond your own edges, seeking out new possibilities, expansion and growth. And it feels like this new moon there is starting a cycle around those themes. How do we seek out or adventure or even pilgrimage beyond the known into new expansive perspectives of ourselves and the worlds that we occupy? It seems like it could be useful to take some time around this new moon to reflect on things like, what do I perceive to be my own limits? What do I feel like the edges of my boundaries of who I know myself to be? What are those things? Where did that story come from? And is it possible that I'm actually more than that? What if I could recognize my own body and myself are not actually static bounded, impermeable forms, but in fact, we are always in a state of dynamic and ongoing emergence, that we are permeable, that we are porous, that we are penetrable and open and expansive, that we are always receiving and opening out onto a world. And when we contemplate that, what fears come up? What's scary about the idea of our own boundaries or our own borders being so open and embracing and expansive? Where do we feel sensations in our body of no, I can't, or just something like the feeling of smallness, or the feeling of being stuck here in this place rather than moving any other place? And I wonder, just at that new moon, because it's the dark of the moon, it's really an introspective time. What happens if you stay with those feelings? What happens if you notice where you experience those sensations of no, I can't, or smallness, or stuck right in this place? What happens if you just sit with that rather than trying to solve it or think our way through it or explain it? How can we just be with those feelings? Because I think the opportunity of the cycle, the opportunity of the lunation cycle that this new moon is initiating, is a cycle of growth and expansion. But before we can grow and expand, I think we have to be able to integrate and hold those parts of ourselves that are afraid of growth and expansion, afraid of moving beyond who we've known ourselves to be. I think that new moon is the start of lunation that's going to climax in December 12th, with the full moon in Gemini. So paying attention to those parts of the chart, what's starting in Sagittarius and culminating in Gemini, and what's that growth cycle. Daniel, you were starting to say something.
Yeah, that makes me think of Austin Coppock's 36 Faces, and the face that the new moon is happening in, of the first decan of Sagittarius, being really about what is the right vehicle for me to inhabit to get to that point B, if again Sagittarius is at point A to point B. And what I really heard you say was about a sense of urgency around finding that, and maybe realizing that you don't need to be urgently looking very far. That maybe there is more that you already have, and that you already have a shape and a form. And if you pay attention to that, and if you understand that form, you can understand its capabilities differently. You can understand that maybe it can get you to where you are trying to go. And with that the Sagittarius, the other planets in Sagittarius being in so far away in those later degrees, it may seem, I think that kind of both builds a sense of urgency to maybe get there fast, but also this idea that like, yeah, but they took time to get there too. And so it also feels like the last hurrah of Jupiter in Sagittarius there, to say like, we're starting a new cycle here, but it's going to be different, and that's okay. And just wait, just wait to see how this comes to fruition.
That makes me think of what Michael brought in last episode, where what was it that you said, Michael? Like when you were talking about Angela Davis, and like maybe the solution is in the slowness and not this urgent temporality of capitalism.
Yeah, it's actually because I talked about Angela Davis and Adrienne Marie Brown, and that is the more from Adrienne Marie Brown's emergent strategy. The idea that we feel we're living in times of such urgency, and we think that the solution has to be equally urgent, but in fact, it's urgency thinking, this constant, unsustainable, accelerating pursuit of growth that brought us to these problems in the first place. And so Adrienne Marie Brown offers that it's possible that the solutions to these urgent crises are actually in the slowness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's like this last hurrah. I love what's being brought together here with the last hurrah of Jupiter in a fire sign, Jupiter going fast to this point, and fire is all about speed and spreading. Sagittarius, like this imagery of the wildfire that I think I heard on the Astrology podcast, spreading like wildfire. And then this last hurrah, with what you're talking about, Michael, the full moon integrating into the body that you already have, or the vehicle, like Daniel's saying, that like what is the vehicle for this journey? And then getting into Jupiter and Capricorn with like, what is the slowness? What is the work? What is the way to go forward that might not be gung-ho Jupiter and Sagittarius, and might be more, what is the next step that I can take to make this vision possible? It's not what Jupiter likes to do, but it's what Jupiter does after Jupiter's in Sagittarius, just to like take the pedal off the metal a little bit and start building.
Yeah, go ahead, Daniel.
I just love the decans and Austin's illustration through words of them, but also through images, because the last decan of Sagittarius is this idea that the vehicle is spent and now you must leave it and you are moving on to bigger and better things. And then the first decan of Capricorn is this headless body planted in the earth. And it's this very, very subconscious, this very big consciousness, not individuated consciousness, awareness of your body and the world around you. This material, like almost like if you were to plant yourself as a seed in the ground to begin to sprout eventually. And just I feel like those images really evoke for me a lot of the different things we've been talking about with this transit. And I will say, please notice how you feel in the month of November with Jupiter things, because I really want to test out this idea that you start to feel Capricorn things. I don't know, like prove me wrong, prove me right. I would love to hear from our listeners and viewers kind of what your experiences of this transition is, and maybe what we have in store for us in Capricorn. And those should announce themselves even more clearly once Jupiter does ingress in December. But see what those little tinglings of the subconscious see, or maybe they're very clear for you as they sometimes are for me. Just be aware. Be aware every moment you can. That's a theme that we've been talking about a lot.
Yeah, just one thing to wrap up with the new moon. I'm not sure if we said the date, that it's November 26th, and I just checked. I misspoke. I said that the moon and sun would be co-present with both benefics, but Venus actually ingresses into Capricorn the day before. So the new moon will still have reception with Jupiter, but Venus will already have started that Capricorn story. So that could also be a bit of a preview or a foreshadowing of things to come with Jupiter's ingress.
Oh, and we should talk about Venus trining Uranus at the end of the month too.
Ooh,
as Venus enters Capricorn. Yeah.
Oh.
The Venus story is not done this month.
Venus story is not done.
So
what are your thoughts on
about
Venus trine Uranus?
What'd you say?
I just said, what are your thoughts on Venus trine Uranus?
This always with Uranus maybe specifically, I always feel like when a planet that's ruling Uranus makes an aspect, it's kind of like checking in, because so much changes with Uranus so rapidly. It feels like sometimes that I think about like those cameras that you can have in your house to like see your pet. Or interact with your pet during the day while you're not at your house. I kind of feel that way. So in what ways is Venus checking in on the story and from the lens of Capricorn? So from the lens of, listen, I know I've got this big project ahead of me, or I've got this big thing ahead of me. Like I'm worried about the order of things or the steps I need to take. Do I have the right resources? And being able to see Uranus in that very harmonious trine is like, yep, you do. You have the resources. Here you go. Apply them. So it does feel to me very, very abundant and very at the same time very small, right? Like you have the pieces to continue to do small things that will start to add up.
I love that idea of checking in on Uranus, and I think one of the reasons that feels very appropriate for Uranus, because Uranus is that planet that's just beyond perceptibility. It's like the next thing, the changes that take place that are not quite changes that we see day to day in our reality, but they come, and when they come, they seem like they come out of nowhere. Because Uranus it's that idea of visible light, and from Earth you can't quite see Uranus, but except in very special moments. So yeah, Venus getting to check in on Uranus in a trine. I love that idea of like finally getting to see what the changes might have been. I think that's really elegant, Daniel.
The other thing.
Oh, good.
The other thing I was going to say too is that the last time Uranus was at those degrees, so when Mars opposes Uranus, it's at 3 degrees 34 minutes, and then Venus is 3 degrees 26 minutes. We had that was back in May, so early May again, right around that Taurus new moon. So the sun was in Taurus, and we see and Venus was also just getting into Taurus to conjoin. And so we are seeing that same kind of 6-month echo that we saw with the new moon, and thinking about all those Venus things. So it's not just a check-in that's random. It feels like a check-in that is very much in alignment with some other larger cycles. So as much as Capricorn feels small, to me it feels big or important, or the sense that it might weave together multiple stories and pieces that have been happening from the last 6 months.
Yeah, that's what I was going to point to, is the Venus-Uranus conjunction back in May 18th, it looks like. And so we just earlier, as Venus moved through Scorpio, went through that opposition of the Venus-Uranus opposition, which is like that climax moment of whatever this cycle is teaching us. This is the moment where perhaps we start to fully understand what it is that needs to change, or what is in a process of change. What patterns are breaking apart? What is being disrupted? What is revolutionary love? And how are we coming to understand that in a new way? Now, as Venus moves into this trine in Earth signs, in Capricorn and Taurus, it feels like, how do we make this revolutionary love sustainable? Venus has reception from Saturn in Capricorn, and so Saturn is invested in the legacy and the long term and the story that unfolds for an extended period of time. And so as Venus makes this aspect, this checking in on Uranus, and this change that's been taking place in this cycle, we're in the second half of that cycle now. So now it feels like it's a stabilizing moment. It feels like it's not that Uranus is stable, but that Uranus and Venus are telling a story together over the course of this cycle. And at this point in the cycle, the waning trine, Venus in Capricorn with Saturn is starting to ask, how do we keep this going? What have we learned about love and connection and our values? And then how do we put those into practice in a way that's sustainable for the long term? Feels like part of what that trine could be showing up as.
What?
Oh, go ahead.
You know what's been just like really sticky in my mind after our last episode together was this idea of temporality and multiple temporalities that we talked about with some of the pieces with Adrienne Marie Brown, but that idea that Angela Davis spoke of we need to get used to not being attached to seeing an outcome and still being able to see the ways that we can contribute to that eventual outcome. And for me, with some of these larger or longer term transits like Uranus, This feels like a little bit of a temporality thing too, where it's like Venus is, you may not know what that outcome is, or you may not have the satisfaction of feeling like it is completing. And yet that idea of sustainability, what is going to sustain us today? What is going to make it a little bit easier to keep going this year, this month, this week? And how do we make room for that in the future? Really, I think is that Capricorn feeling. There's a lot that Capricorn and Saturn really feel like that reminder that there are multiple temporalities, and we do experience these longer cycles. So yeah, I just still really buzzing after that conversation.
And the longer cycles, coming back to what you just mentioned briefly earlier, Daniel, about awareness and the importance of awareness, and that's a theme that has been so important as we've been in dialogue with Michael about bringing knowledge, astrological knowledge or experiential knowledge of any kind back to the body. How can we navigate these cycles, these multiple temporalities, in ways that do not lose their meaning in the ether of fast capitalism? How can we bring things into material form, and maybe that's sustainable?
Yeah, totally. I think it's such a revolutionary act in this day and age, in the world that we're living in, to drop our attention down beneath the neck, to actually notice the breath, to actually feel our flesh supported by bone, to feel the relationship between the bones of our body and the bedrock of the earth, to notice what it feels like to talk about multiple forms of temporality simultaneously, to feel how some parts of our body are rushing through our circulatory system and other parts of our body are millions of years old at the same time. And actually taking and even making a practice of noticing and feeling those things feels, I mean, especially, I mean, not that we're still talking about the Venus-Uranus trine, but in these earth signs, what's sustainable, I think is going to require us to attend to our own materiality, to so often in spiritual practices or any sort of knowledge tradition or wisdom tradition, it becomes so cerebral. And even sometimes there can be a kind of spiritual bypassing of like, we're so devoted to the practice of spirit that we want to escape the body in some way. And that's not my bias. I think that the body is the site at which all of this is happening. And so in order to come into any sort of meaningful expansion of consciousness or practice of healing, we have to be in a relationship to the body and how we are experiencing awareness as a body. Awareness is not a disembodied state. Awareness is a felt state of a system that is a body, in relation to other bodies, in relation to other systems. And that just feels so integral to my practice, at least in terms of astrology.
Well, and to tie together a couple things we talked about too, Sagittarius, we're like really talking about that transition between these two signs, Sagittarius and Capricorn. Sagittarius being a fire sign reinforces that idea of the temporality that's right in front of you, that feels the most urgent, that feels like you need to fuel yourself with all of the things, make these sacrifices because the journey isn't over until you reach that goal. And then you can leave this body that's been used and spent. And that transition into Capricorn where it's like, no, the body's where it starts. And it's that cooling down of that urgency into this cool earth. I think that's going to be really refreshing for a lot of folks that have maybe felt like they're running around with their head on fire this year. And fire can be a good thing. I'm a Sagittarius rising, so like I've been like, yes, me, all of the things. thinking about how my identity has just felt lit up in all of these wonderful ways. And then how do I now integrate that energy and that inspiration and that joy that I've experienced from that growth and incorporate it back into a larger awareness and an awareness that incorporates the physical and elevates the physical and elevates the importance of taking care of our bodies. It is that really earthy thing that I think it will be interesting to see how things play out in Capricorn, but then inevitably explode into Aquarius. And I don't want to talk too much more about like future, that far in the future, 2020 stuff, but let's enjoy this moment. Let's enjoy this cooling down, this celebration this month that Venus is bringing to the mix, and then helping us let go of in favor of a more measured, more embodied awareness, rather than such a cerebral or flamey awareness.
Michael, is there anything that you'd like to wrap up with?
I mean, I think what Daniel just said was such a beautiful, like, wrapping up of all the things. Part of me is still like, but we didn't talk about Neptune stationing direct.
I was going to say something too. Yeah.
Okay, then let's just like try to hit it briefly, not linger forever on it.
Wait, you know the movie, what's the movie? Lord of the Rings. Okay, so you know this movie about Jack Nicholson seeing Lord of the Rings and Elijah Wood, who plays Frodo Baggins, like meeting Jack Nicholson and being like, hey, what do you think of Lord of the Rings? And Jack Nicholson's like, oh, it sucked. It had way too many endings. I feel like that's our podcast, but our podcast is awesome. So plus the awesome.
I mean, we should definitely marathon our podcast the way they marathon Lord of the Rings. If you haven't started listening to past episodes, line up a party with your friends.
It sounds amazing.
Sorry for the digression. Let's talk about Neptune.
Speaking of digressions, Neptune. So on November 27th, Neptune is going to station direct at around 15 degrees Pisces. Neptune has been retrograde since June 21st. And my sense of retrogrades in general, whether they're outer planets, inner planets, is that it's a period of review, it's reflection, it's recollection, it's remembering, it's bringing back together or experiencing in a different way the things that came before. And Neptune is this super slow-moving outer planet that signifies things like mysticism and spiritual consciousness and dreams and fantasy and the experience of non-ordinary realities. And so I guess the questions that I'm going to be pondering as we approach this station is, what have I been learning to do with those sorts of practices since June in terms of mystical practices, spiritual consciousness, tuning into non-ordinary realities? What have the ancestors been speaking? This idea of looking back to the traditions that came before. What has been coming up in ancestral knowledge, in reintegrating or reviewing traditional knowledges that come from before? How have traditions been returning to my life or to our lives? And then when Neptune stations direct, it feels like it's a time to move forward with that knowledge. We've gathered these traditions, we've reflected and reviewed and remembered this knowledge that comes from before us, and now we move forward with it. And that could take different forms. That could be, I put them into practice, I make them part of my life. It could also be, I innovate them. I find, what does this tradition, what do these ancient knowledges, or what do these experiences from beyond the veil, from some non-ordinary sense of reality, how do they live in 2019? How do I integrate them into my own practice and into my practice with others? Feels like part of what we could be thinking about as we approach that station.
I love that too, because however one feels about the actual impact or felt impact of these slow moving outer planets, I think I definitely have been feeling the Neptune. And for me, it's felt like a fuzziness. And I think because Neptune's currently starting to transit in its like very slow oscillation, my IC and my North node, which are like 5 minutes away from each other. And it feels like there's a fuzziness around my sense of direction, and also my sense of that midheaven IC like connection, or that axis where it's like, where's my private life, where's my public life, where's my work life all heading? And inevitably it's being pulled toward astrology and these practices that I was a math major, that I feel this intense materialism, or this intense analytical side being kind of washed away, and making room for some of that that you talk about. And it's been mystical and magical and fuzzy and uncomfortable. And I think that as it's been slowly retrograding, it's moved farther away from that. So I feel like I'm coming up for air from this sea of Pisces. And I'm prepared to go back under and actually have Neptune cross that and then go retrograde again. But it really, I do see that transition from retrograde to direct as being able to now externalize or materialize some of the things that you've been reflecting on or processing internally. So I'm excited to think about what's happening after that station for me. And I'd be interested also, if anyone has great Neptune stories. I really do love the mutable signs. Anyone got great Neptune stories, let us know too. Is that it? Have we run out of fuel?
I think we've run out of endings. I'm immensely, I've said the word gratitude more times than I can count in the last week or so, ever since we started this conversation. And I feel actually forever changed by what has happened over this silly thing we call Zoom. And I hope that anybody who has listened to parts of this or the entire thing, praise you. I think that I hope, and I actually sincerely believe that this is impactful and out there. And I thank Michael for making that possible.
Well, it's the two. Some feelings. It's the two of you who make it possible. So thanks for holding this space and creating a container to have meaningful conversations where our astrology is not removed from our lives as embodied people, as queer people, as people who have navigated the complexities of what it means to move through a world in which parts of us are still not embraced, and parts of us are still not made welcome, and parts of us are made to feel as if we don't belong. So to have a conversation, to have multiple conversations where we get to think and experience and feel and connect around the ways that this ancient tradition becomes a resource for how we're living our lives today, feels totally invaluable. And yeah, I'm so grateful to be in this dialogue and to share it with the three of us, and then to share it with others.
Speaking of which, Michael, do you have any events coming up or any classes coming up that you would like to share or spread awareness of, as I hope all of our listeners and viewers will follow Michael on Instagram, on Twitter, and we will post all of those links in the show notes. But is there anything you would like to really share opportunities for furthering some of the topics we may have talked about today?
I am booking consultations I work with astrology, obviously, and also tarot if people are interested in working with that modality. In Columbus, Ohio, I do in-person consultations at Witch Lab in Franklinton. And for everyone else, I do consults via Zoom. And so that booking information is on my website, which is michaeljmorris.co. And then I do have a lot coming up. I don't know how much of it's like public offerings I'm doing. In November, I'm speaking on a panel called Trans Ecological Justice at the American Studies Association conference in Hawaii. In December, I'm co-facilitating an event called Rituals for Livable Futures at Flux and Flow Movement Center in Columbus, Ohio. I think that date is December 20th. I'll post about it on social medias. In January, I'm teaching at the School for New Dance Development in Amsterdam. I'm teaching gender studies for choreographers in their bachelor's program. What else am I doing? I'm adjudicating the American College Dance Association conference in Long Beach in March. And then I'm attending the Northwest Astrological Conference in Seattle in May. I'm not presenting, just attending and connecting to this beautiful, radiant community in person, embodied in shared time and space. Yeah, that's what I have going on.
And we'll be in NORWAC too, and we're probably going to talk about it 5 million times before then. So people will hear all about NORWAC.
Let's do that like Storm Area 51 thing, but for NORWAC. Like, let's just all show up. That'd be great.
I'll see you all there.
We will. And we'll see you before then too, I have a feeling.
I have a feeling too.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you guys so much.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for listening.